Special welcome to those who joined us online, and Kamal Krishore, who's joined us from India. Welcome to you, Kamal. We can see you clearly, and we'll be able to hear you, I'm sure, in due course. My name's Sam Bickersteth, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this conversation about climate resilience, key to achieving the SDGs. I'm very much part of ODI, I like to think, but my job is to lead the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, CDKN, which is delivered in part through colleagues in ODI, so it's always a pleasure to be here. And I suppose it won't have escaped your attention that we're less than 6 weeks away from the start of the COP21 in Paris. And it feels to me over the last couple of weeks, depends what universe you spin in towards Paris, or at all with respect to Paris, that we've been thinking rather hard about INDCs and emissions gaps the last couple of weeks. How big is the gap going to be? Are the INDCs, 90% of the commitments are in? Will that get us to 2 degrees? Probably not. What will it be? That feels to have been quite a lot of the focus. And deliberately, with our colleagues in ODI, CDK and ODI decided to hold this event to remind ourselves that there's some very important other agendas out there beyond that in the mitigation of greenhouse gases. Paris will deliver something in relation to adaptation, we hope. Developing countries certainly will be demanding that. It's not clear what it will be. It will probably deliver something on climate finance. It may or may not deliver much on loss and damage. There's still ongoing conversation around where it sits in the text, where that sits in the text, and what degree of commitment there is to it. It probably won't deliver a global adaptation goal, unless any of you have information otherwise to that. It seems to me that seems fairly improbable. However, the UN itself, across its own system, is keen to see a balanced outcome in terms of adaptation and resilience and mitigation and low carbon in the agreement in Paris, and has been developing a framework which it wants to share in Paris and move forward afterwards, which it's calling A2R. Anticipating, absorbing and reshaping development pathways. It's another way of looking at the resilience agenda. But I think that's important that the UN itself is trying to see some, to aim for some sort of balance. But this event comes after other important international processes with respect to climate resilience. That's the Sendai Agreement many months ago, you may remember. And the UNGA, the SDGs, you won't forget because they've been quite recent and pretty much on our screens a lot of the time. So those are the international agreements, and there'll be more coming next year, the World Humanitarian Summit, of course, which I'm sure will keep Debbie busy. But of course, none of them make any difference unless they deliver something on the ground. And I hope today's discussion will remind us that 2016 needs to be a year of implementation, a year in which countries, international agencies, organisations like ourselves, CDK and ODI, are facilitating and enabling, yes, maybe some low-carbon development, but yes, definitely some resilient development in the delivery of what we call climate-compatible development. That's going to be the priority. That's what people are asking for in the face of climate change, is what people are asking for in the face of typhoons as we speak in the Philippines and other parts of the world. So resilient development is the focus of our conversation today, framed by some of these international processes. And I think we've got a brilliant panel to share some perspectives and open up a conversation with you all. I hope there's lots of people online, and those on you online are invited to start firing questions through the system to me in due course. So we've got 4 speakers. Before that, we've got a film. I'll just tell you who the speakers are, and then we're going to watch a video for a few minutes. In order of importance, I will know. I'll start with Kamal Krishore as our most important guest from afar in India. Kamal works for the National Disaster Management Agency. The screens have gone blank, not because you're not there, Kamal. We can see you again briefly. But it's a real pleasure to have you online as part of a important institution that plays a very significant and effective role across India. We have next, in terms of importance, I'll stop there. There are 3 very important people who are all present and past colleagues of mine. So I fixed this entirely on the grounds that I knew these people. On my left, Dan Dowling, who is based at PwC, which is where I am as well. Dan's an assistant director focusing on urbanisation and climate change, and would like to share a kind of a business perspective on this agenda. Very significant part of the solution, that business solution. On my right is Debbie Hillier, former colleague of mine at Oxfam, who is a humanitarian policy advisor, who's found time to come join this conversation today, and you've been working closely with ODI on these agendas and some of the background papers anyway, Debbie. And then Emily Wilkinson here at ODI, who works within the CDKN team as well, is a research fellow. So I think you know the panel, and I think with Rob's assistance we're going to watch a video for a few minutes, which may help frame our conversation.
All India Radio presents Morning News. Uttar Pradesh is experiencing widespread rain and thunderstorms under the influence of cyclone Hudhud.
ऐसा बारिश हुआ कि धरती तहस नहस हो गई। इसके लिए धान की खेती उसमें आधा मार गई।
Roughly the losses because of floods, drought, hailstorm veered in the range of 7,000 crores. And this year itself, this hailstorm, we have losses in the range of more than 7,500 crores only.
They are furious and unforgiving, and they hit the lives of those who anyway live on the margins. These are tough people who endure the havoc of floods year after year. But now, the weather is testing them beyond their nerves.
अभी क्या है कि ये जो फ्लड का आने का जो ट्रेंड है वो बहुत फास्ट हो गया। फ्लैश फ्लड्स आती हैं, जो लैंडस्लाइड्स है वो हो रही हैं, जो पानी का आना है और रुकना है वो ज़्यादा हो गया। तो इन स्पाइट ऑफ बेस्ट प्रिपेयर्डनेस उसके लिए कोई नहीं तैयार होता कि ये जो अनसर्टेनिटीज़ हैं इस तरीके की।
With every passing year, it was clear that Gorakhpur's flood response-centric disaster management plan was failing to meet the crisis of erratic weather patterns. Something had to change. In 2013, a dynamic group of institutions joined hands with the Gorakhpur District Disaster Management Authority to demonstrate a fresh approach that integrated climate concerns into disaster management planning. A series of shared learning dialogues held with various line departments brought together the perceptions of all stakeholders into the planning process.
शेयर लर्निंग डायलॉग एक प्रोसेस ये है कि जिसमें हम अपनी क्लाइमेट की जानकारी या हमारी जो एक्सपर्ट जानकारी है और जो लोगों की जानकारी है जिनके साथ हम काम कर रहे हैं, चाहे वो फ्रंटलाइन फंक्शनरी हो, चाहे वो डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिपार्टमेंट हो, चाहे वो गांव का या शहर का एक गरीब आदमी हो, उनकी जानकारी, उनकी विजडम, उनका नॉलेज और हमारी जो टेक्निकल नॉलेज है, इन दोनों का कन्वर्जेंस हो सके, उन दोनों को इंटीग्रेट किया जा सके और उसके द्वारा जो सॉल्यूशंस निकलते हैं वो इफ़ेक्टिव होते हैं, वो सस्टेन करते हैं.
Each line department of the district that deals with disaster management got down to analyzing its vulnerabilities under different climatic conditions. Guided by climate experts and local knowledge, they identified existing gaps in their planning process and came up with key areas of improvement. These revised departmental plans then converged into a forward-looking district disaster management plan, complete with a wide range of recommendations that would build the resilience of Gorakhpur district. While every second field in Gorakhpur reminds of the devastating loss of wheat this season, there are also fields which are lush with other crops.
पहले तो बहुत कम फसल करते थे, जानकारी नहीं था, जो सीधा लगता था उसको धान गेहूं करते थे। इस समय हम लोग 75 किस्म का हम खेती साल में निकाले हैं। मिलवा फसल जब हम बोएंगे, मिश्रित खेती, एक खेती के साथ कई खेती करेंगे तो एक फसल चला जाएगा, दूसरा हो जाएगा।
These farmers have gone a step ahead to reclaim their autonomy over seeds. They run a seed bank that sells traditional and climate resilient seeds to fellow farmers.
मोटा अनाज का खेती हम लोग करेंगे तो उसमें तो कितना भी आपदा आएगा, पानी बरसेगा, सूखा पड़ेगा तो नहीं जाएगा, वो तो कुछ हो जाएगा। जैसे सावा, कोदो, मड़ुआ पुराने ज़माना का आज के 50 साल पहले जो खेती होता था, वो खेती जब हम लोग शुरू कर दिए हैं उसमें तो कुछ नहीं तो खाने के लिए हमको हो जाएगा, कितना भी आपदा आएगा।
पूरे गांव में चारों तरफ से पानी होता है।
Being at the forefront, local communities are the first responders to disaster. Under a grant from the 13th Finance Commission, the Uttar Pradesh state government is giving skills and resources to nearly 9,000 vulnerable gram panchayats so that they can better prepare for disasters.
दू भदेली धई देली, भदेली के ऊपर प्लास्टिक धई के ओके पहले एक ठो रस्सी से बांध दे।
If you train a woman on certain disaster mitigation practices or response practices or relief practices, in turn she would train 10 other people. So they are a great change agent. In our community-based program, we are involving more and more women, only because they give cascading effect to the training programs or to the learning which they are given.
In India, Gorakhpur district is treading on this new path to create a safe and resilient future for its people. Will the rest of India pay heed?
खास बात यही है कि अंडरलाइंग कॉजेज ऑफ रिस्क, जिनकी वजह से रिस्क बढ़ता है, और जब रिस्क बढ़ता है तो कोई घटना होने पे डिजास्टर का स्वरूप बड़ा होता है, नुकसान ज़्यादा होता है, उनको एड्रेस किया जाए हमारे डेवलपमेंट प्लान्स के माध्यम से। हम वेट ना करें कि कोई डिजास्टर हो, बल्कि जो भी हमारे डेवलपमेंट के प्लान्स बने उसमें उसको शामिल कर लें और उसके बाद हमारा जो डिस्ट्रिक्ट का है डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट प्लान बने।
So thank you very much for that. As you can see, that's a CDKN produced film, and I hope it frames our conversation nicely and brings us to solutions to some of the challenges ahead. And I'll pass first to Debbie Hillier to get your perspectives.
Can I have the clicker? Thank you. Great. It's good to be here today. Thank you for coming. I think that film's been very interesting about what can happen in one region, and we'll hear more from Kamal, I guess, later about what is happening elsewhere in India. I think I want to just step back a little bit and look at just something that's happening right now, which is the El Nino crisis, which is just starting to kick off. This is not the best map in the world, but it just shows that this is a global issue, that this will affect big parts of the world. Some will be drier, some will be wetter. This is already on a last year, which was already a very difficult year for many farmers. So we have a very difficult situation coming up, and the impacts are already very clear. This is Ethiopia at the moment in the pastoralist region. One of my colleagues who has been working in the Horn of Africa for many years said he was shocked that it's still 5 months away from any more rain in Ethiopia, and that's already the situation that we have. This is Papua New Guinea, where drought and frost in the highlands have been destroying the crops. And this is from the sort of dry corridor of Central America. So you can see that this year, the next 6 to 9 months are going to be very difficult for very many people. This is not, however, just a negative story, because we know that some governments have been doing a lot. The Ethiopian government has established a national council under the lead of the Deputy Prime Minister, allocated nearly $200 million for food and non-food items, cancelled all road construction next year to pay for all this, committed to buying 400,000 to 600,000 tonnes of grain. So the government is taking a very proactive approach and trying to support its people. Similar in Indonesia, where 34 regions have been declared drought, but the government is trying to cloud seed, distributing water pumps and so on. So I think there is a very difficult season coming up, but that's not to say that things aren't happening. But I think just wanted to frame today's discussion in a sort of crisis of today. So, but what I'm really here to talk about is some of the international agreements and how and whether they help to build climate resilience. So first of all, I'll talk about the Sendai Framework, and then a bit more on the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. So I don't know how many of you here were at the Sendai meeting, which happened in March this year in Japan, which developed this framework for DRR. I think it's fair to say that there were mixed views amongst the NGOs. I think Oxfam was not particularly pleased. These are some of the Oxfam quotes about the Sendai Framework. For Oxfam, we were hoping that Sendai would set an ambitious agenda that would set the kind of 2015 off to in a very strong start, helping governments be ambitious, look to the future, help to create a kind of step change in risk reduction. As most of you know, that didn't happen. And instead of that ambitious framework, it was in some ways actually held hostage by others. So governments refused to agree to any more money because of the Addis conference in July, and then refused to agree anything on climate because of the COP. So I think for Oxfam we were disappointed. But what's in there? So I think there are some good things in there. There are some good words on empowering local level actors and on marginalised groups, and specifically looking at those marginalised groups as impacted, but also as agents of change. So not only as vulnerable and as victims, but also as agents of change. So this is positive. However, most of these good words are in the preamble and not in the operative paragraphs. So we'll have to see what that means sort of going forwards. The climate linkages, the linkages with the SDGs and the COP were very weak. They were taken out pretty much in the last hours, which again is a very big missed opportunity. There's no link between UNFCCC Adaptation Committee and the Sendai Framework, which we think there should be. So that was disappointing. No more money, as I've said already. Additional and predictable finance, there was no agreement on that. And yet the principle of common but differentiated responsibility means that some of the developed countries should be taking a more proactive approach to that. And there were some targets, and that's something that Oxfam had been pushing on very hard. So we're very pleased that there are 7 new global targets in the Sendai Framework. There weren't any percentages in those, so it was substantially reduced rather than reduced by X%. Now, on reflection, that's probably not surprising. I think collectively we hadn't done the maths on what those percentages should be, but nonetheless, it was a little disappointing. But there's, more importantly, perhaps, there's no commitment on actually agreeing a baseline. So I think in sort of impact of those targets, we'll have to wait and see. And the implementation, for me, is not clear. With the Hyogo framework, imperfect though it was, we had a nice 1-page schematic which would stick on people's walls. We now have a 25-page document, and turning that into implementation, I'm not sure. So hopefully Kamal can gee us up with lots of enthusiasm about how it's working in India. Certainly I've just been in Nepal, and they're developing a new disaster management law there, which has been on the books for 7 years. Long story. But there is no mention of Sendai or global targets, global agreements, the principles of Sendai. There's no reference at all to international agreements in the current draft of the new Nepalese law. So I think something, and yet Nepal was clearly at Sendai and sort of adopted it along with everyone else. So I think there is a bit of an implementation gap that I'm seeing. Hopefully Kamal will put me right on that one. So we'll have to wait and see how it's implemented. I think there is potential, but I think it's not clear yet. And then the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've come a long way in this process. So in the first document that came out of this process, which was February 2014, it was the Focus Areas document, it was called, produced by the co-chairs of the Open Working Group. There were 3 references to climate/resilience. And they weren't particularly significant. They were relatively small references. And now, as you can see, this is what is in the SDGs. So those are the numbers of the targets and a sort of summary of what is in those targets. So I think for those of us working in this area, I think we're very pleased that actually there's some really good stuff in the SDGs from our point of view. As I said, we've come a long way, and there's a particularly strong target 1.5, which sits under the goal 1, that's the poverty goal. So there's a very strong link now between poverty and resilience, and that wasn't there kind of 18 months ago at the beginning of this process. So that has been a real win, I think, in the process, that we now have a hardwired link between poverty and shocks and stresses. And for me, this is very important because we know there is a very strong link between poverty and shocks and stresses, whether they're climate or financial or geological. So this hard link, I think, is very important, certainly for Oxfam. So there are 2 targets I want to just briefly mention today. So as I said, this one under the poverty goal, target 1.5, which is my personal favourite, and then and then 13.1 under the climate change goal, which is also very strong. So this target 1.5 talks about building resilience, talks about reducing exposure and reducing vulnerability, and it also talks about economic, social and environmental shocks. So it's a huge target. It's a sort of target that an NGO would write, frankly, which is quite difficult to achieve. But nonetheless, there it is, enshrined in the SDGs. So very happy about that. So as you know, the SDGs are now agreed. So with now the process is on how do we measure these. So what we've got agreed so far are goals and targets. And the process now is on developing indicators. And I want to talk a little bit about measurement. So although this can seem a rather dry and technical debate, how do you measure these things? It is actually very important. And at the moment, the proposed indicator for both of those 2 targets is this one here. So the number of deaths, missing people, injured, relocated or evacuated due to disasters. So whilst we have some quite nice broad targets, that indicator, as you can see, is a pretty narrow one. And it's one that many of us working on resilience and climate don't feel reflects those particular targets. As you can see, it's looking at disasters that have happened, so it's entirely backward-looking. It's slightly odd in that it looks at the number of deaths and evacuated people. So numbers of deaths is clearly a bad thing. Number of people evacuated is not necessarily a bad thing. If a government is managed to evacuate people, that's a good thing. So there's slight anomalies within the target anyway. But more importantly, resilience is about capacity, isn't it? It's about the capacity to absorb shocks, to anticipate, to adapt. And that is not reflected at all in that indicator. So measurement is an incredibly important thing. And what we want from these indicators are 2 things, really. There needs to be a management tool to help countries manage their performance and a report card so those countries can report in, if you like, to the global situation. Ooh, what have I done with this? Here we go. So yeah, this again is one of my favourite quotes. Actually, data is important. Governments have signed up to these SDGs and they must be held accountable to it. So there is a movement now to try and look at how we can improve the measurements of these targets. And as you will see, you'll have been given one of these, I think. Everyone's been given one of these. So this is a paper written by ODI with input from Oxfam and OECD on how what we think a better measurement of the target would look like. There are lots of other suggestions. These are all ones that have been, they've gone into the kind of process now for developing these indicators. So some of the comments there and some of the other suggestions for what a better indicator might be. I think I guess the issue is that we need to make sure we get a decent indicator, and it doesn't need to be the ODI one, it doesn't need to be any of these, but it does need to be a better one that reflects what we're trying to do with climate resilience. And the process now, that there's a meeting at the end of October in Bangkok where statistical offices will get together and try and figure out what this measurement should look like for this indicator, for this target. And Oxfam and others are pushing that we need a review here, and what we want is a sort of decent indicator which will realise the promise of the SDGs and to make sure that no one is left behind.
Debbie, thank you very much indeed. Lots of material in there to pick up on. Emily, can you...
Thank you. Okay, so moving in a slightly different direction into sort of thinking about implementation of these frameworks, I'm going to present today a new framework which we've been developing with the World Bank, with the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, that looks at for better considering the effectiveness of resilience building and for incentivising investment and improving implementation of these global agreements. So we're calling it the triple dividend of resilience, and the framework is really the product of an 18-month collaboration and proposes that investment in disaster risk management should be considered something that's good for wealth, good for well-being, good for profit, good for productivity and growth. So this is really about sustainable development, not just reducing disaster losses, and that we need a framework and a way of measuring investment in disaster risk management that is irrespective of disaster losses, disaster loss calculations. So this is still really a proposition, and I invite you at the end to provide your sort of feedback and insights on whether or not you think this is a convincing argument, and whether or not you have examples of where this might be the case. But first, let's just sort of take a step back and look at the problem of disaster risk. And some of you may be familiar with the chart at the top, and where we can see that despite considerable efforts to reduce disaster risk and address losses, annual average losses continue to rise, and we can see that the increase from around 50 billion in the 1980s to sort of $300 billion today, and most of this is climate related, so we can see that in the chart at the top. And the bottom infographic from another ODI publication shows us that investment in ex-ante risk reduction, so before a disaster occurs, continues to be very low, a very small percentage of what we're spending on dealing with disasters as a whole. So there has been some improvement. The ratio a decade ago was 95% sort of wait and see, 5% ex-ante investments. Today, that's shifted to 87 versus 13%. So we've definitely seen some improvement. There are a number of disincentives for investing in resilience, which a lot of us will be aware of. So despite the fact that there's been this kind of unprecedented support for climate resilience in the post-2015 frameworks, as Debbie was referring to, and resilience has definitely become a kind of compelling concept drawing these agendas together. There's still a lot of myopia, a political myopia, and governments, for many reasons, underinvesting in DRR. Reasons kind of for everything from lack of resources to a limited understanding of risks and impacts. And in particular, DRM suffers from lack of salience with the public, as the benefits are really very difficult to perceive unless a disaster occurs. And broadly, we see more investment in disaster response and relief. It's more visible, and there's the ready availability of international support makes that a more attractive option. And there are certain immediate costs of investing in DRR, always sort of put against the uncertain benefits. You can be very clear about what you have to spend on DRR, but very unclear about what the benefits might be in the future. And there are very few examples of where we can actually calculate what the success of these investments are in terms of avoided losses. Bangladesh is one quite often cited example. In 1991, a Category 5 cyclone killed 138,000 people. By 2007, a very similar strength storm saw a huge drop in mortality. 3,400 or so people were killed in that hurricane. So we can see there are some of these examples, but they're few and far between, and the losses and the benefits of DRR are difficult to calculate. And in a way, you could see that as a sort of a lucky scenario where a similar event occurred that we could measure the difference against. So there's a bit of sense of the benefits of investing in DRR depending on rolling a dice, and hence the picture of a dice there. So mostly huge uncertainties in calculating the future benefits if and when a disaster occurs. And I think methods of appraising DRR investments fail to provide that adequate kind of incentives because they undervalue the resulting benefit streams, and as a result, DRR is often perceived as a sunk cost if a disaster doesn't strike. So clearly kind of not enough incentive for really increasing these investments, and that's one of the things that we were interested in looking at altering. What could we do about to improve thinking around the incentive structures? And there's a book that came out this year, I think, Joseph Roden's book that focuses on the resilience dividend. So this is where the idea of resilience dividend sort of really first appears. And she looks at the serendipitous resilience, really sort of looking backwards at where there have been additional benefits of investing in one thing and seeing kind of co-benefits in terms of economic growth, for example, of investments in transport systems. So it's not looking specifically at disasters or climate resilience. But we want to think about how we can improve these incentive structures in the absence of disasters. We can't rely on a disaster to happen. So just a note, a lot of emphasis has been placed on improving cost-benefit analysis. So how can we get that better? Will that do the job in terms of promoting greater investment? And so there's been more emphasis recently to look at the ripple effects on the economy and society of disasters and get a fuller picture of these. But importantly, these methods still are reliant on disasters occurring, and we need to look at other benefits that help reduce the background risk. So the risks that stop businesses from investing, and other economic, social, and environmental co-benefits. So I'm going to talk a bit more about those, what they look like, and some examples. So this is the framework, the triple resilience, triple dividend of resilience framework. The top one is the first dividend of resilience. We know a lot about that, the avoided losses argument. The second one is about reducing this background risk that prevents individuals and businesses from investing and from taking calculated positive risks that are needed for economic growth. Because of the potential for disruption from disaster events. And I can give an example, the Loma Prieta earthquake closing down the San Francisco-Oakland Bridge for a month in 1989. This has consequences for investment decisions. And if these risks and uncertainties can be reduced, then the hypothesis is that the overall benefits in terms of increasing long-term capital investment, entrepreneurship, productivity, and economic growth can be realised. And I think we've looked at benefits to the broader economy, but also to businesses themselves. And these might include improving credit ratings, for example. So since 2005, 60% of negative rating actions by Standard & Poor's occurred as a result of storms, floods, droughts, and earthquakes, just to give you an indication of that. We see that insurance and social protection programs aimed at reducing disaster impacts also have benefits in terms of productivity, that small businesses are able to make productive investments as a result of having that insurance in place. And there are examples of that, including the Cadena program in Mexico, which is a weather index insurance scheme. So benefits to individual businesses of having this kind of protection insurance in place. Also, we observed increasing land values as a result of investments in protective infrastructure and a number of fiscal risk management dividends. Moving on to the third dividend of resilience, this is about the co-benefits of very specific investments in DRR, the sort of positive economic, environmental and social side effects that can occur. And I mean, there are lots and lots of examples of this. I think the difficulty we've had is really in quantifying them and bringing them together and really sort of developing a typology for the range of benefits that exist. But I'll give you just one example of a flood defense project in the state of Tabasco in Mexico, which invested a lot of money in flood defense between 2007 and 2010. And the World Bank was able to calculate avoided damage because there were floods in 2010. So that was estimated to be equivalent to around $3 billion. But what it didn't include, and what was sort of later observed, was that the capital of the state of Tabasco saw substantial improvements in the urban environment as well as a result of these investments in flood defense. So, for example, small-scale projects with environmental benefits have been initiated, tree planting on riverbanks to prevent landslides, people disposing of litter more responsibly and throwing less into the streets and the drains and so on to avoid them becoming blocked during rainy season. So you could see that this flood defence project had kind of catalysed other investments and other actions which improved the environment. So what we're saying by developing this framework, and what I think is really important here, is that we can generate a more compelling narrative for investing in resilience and enable more resilient forms of development in a changing climate that don't just rely on disasters occurring for these benefits to be realised, and that we should see disaster risk management not as an objective in and of itself, but rather an important kind of lever for generating overall development progress. Thanks.
Emily, thank you very much. I'll go straight on to you, Dan.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. So I'm here to talk about the role of business primarily. And over the past 5 years or so, I've been helping to advise public policymakers primarily on how they can engage business. And the best way I've been able to do that is to spend as much time with business as possible, understanding how they perceive this landscape of resilience and why it matters to them. As we go into the end of the year, I would like to see us appreciate the efforts of the 2015 frameworks and putting together a clearly very complex set of principles and goals together. It's a frustrating process, but I think recognition and appreciation is right. I think celebration is wrong because we don't yet have anything to celebrate. I agree that next year is the start of the implementation cycle. And one reason why I don't think we should be celebrating is because I think the private sector has largely been left out of the solution at this stage. And that's deeply frustrating to get to the end of 2015 and still not have anything other than what barely warrants being called lip service included in these agreements and frameworks. Because that's going to have a legacy impact. And whether we can even get the private sector to the table in the next 5 years or so now is a real question for me. And you know, really the job isn't done, and if the private sector's got 80% of the investment in infrastructure, in solutions, in markets, in supply chains, right down to smallholder growers, I just don't understand where this can really take us. I'm not suggesting all is lost. I'm just suggesting we've got through the difficult public political negotiation. I think we really need to focus in 2016 on that private sector framework. Just reflecting for a minute or so on what we found out previously. So about 3 years ago now, we did a big piece of research with the UK Department for International Development right through from multinational corporations through to 4 individual countries, to try and understand why business was struggling with the resilience agenda and the frameworks around disaster risk and adaptation. And we heard a number of things that are fairly intuitive. I think we realised that awareness actually was growing, but confusion was growing at the same time. I think the issues are not framed in a way that the business understands. The language of countries and politics and policy is not the language of business, which is about markets, solutions, products, and regulation. That's how business acts and what it responds to. And until we shape this in a way that sectors can understand, I think we're going to struggle to see a lot of action. Those businesses themselves are still understand. They are being held to account in some ways because they're being held to account really by disasters themselves. But we all know about the psychology of disasters and how a reaction to a significant event is usually quite focused. It doesn't usually sustain, and it doesn't always ripple out to the actions that others take as well. So the system doesn't work just by pointing at the losses, at the numbers, at the opportunities. I think that's an important part of the nudge tactics, but don't we need to do something a bit more concrete, a bit more gutsy perhaps, to leverage this huge potential of this market? With the work we completed, and actually something that subsequently followed, which was the establishment of something called the RISE initiative, which was a partnership between the UN ISDR and a number of private sector entities to think about how public-private collaboration could work. We've been sort of testing some of these models and ideas, and I guess we furthered our understanding of some of the problems here. One of them is that resilience itself it's not a commodity item. It's not something that can be tangibly traded or valued at the moment. And I think it's a major shift we need to make. And we often point to the insurance industry at this point. And I think the insurance industry does understand how to price risk and how to quantify investment. It just still seems strange that we haven't managed to permeate that sort of thinking and that sort of data and quality modelling and tools, etc., into other corporate sectors. And to countries as well, for that matter, to look at some of the development benefits and some of the co-benefits that arise. So I think we've got some real challenges. That said, we've learned more about how the great things that the private sector can do. There's capacity, there's technology, there's knowledge and know-how, and businesses can be great at operating at the local level. I think whilst multinationals are struggling with their non-asset risks, so their risks embedded in their supply chains that often extend right down to very local places that are far away from headquarters, often far away from consumer markets. But actually local companies, from an ethical standpoint and from a practical standpoint, really do understand the issues and often are involved at the front line and in the response. What there is, unfortunately, is a disconnect often between the corporate headquarters and the local environment in which their suppliers are operating. So we can do something there to connect those areas. I think a lot of what's been done to try and address this issue in the last few years is public policy thinking with public policy language. And I think that is important to creating a better enabling environment of knowledge, supporting research and other important parts of the picture. But we need to get on to this idea of being able to account for, to codify activity, to quantify risk and to price it. If we can get those elements right in this, I think business will immediately get it and will stop having to push business to take some action, but business will grab the ball and run away with it. And that's exactly what we want to do, as long as they're still operating within certain boundaries, of course. So just finally, I just wanted to say, well, what could we really do in 2016? A couple of years ago, our recommendations were fourfold. 1, deal with the public policy agenda. 2, deal with operational risk, know-how, knowledge and tools within corporations. 3, encourage and incentivize the development of new products and services and business opportunities in resilience. And 4, deal with some rules and norms around the investment environment, particularly into infrastructure. I think all of those still stand, they're valid. But to be a bit more specific, I'm increasingly supportive of the role of some form of foundation legislation or regulatory framework that at least underpins who should be doing what, what the roles and responsibilities are effectively, and what the minimum requirements are for any entity operating in a given market. Now, whether we do that at country or sector level is to be resolved, but I think there's some minimum foundation required here, because I think business needs to know that this is a space which government is willing to take affirmative action. I still would agree with the premise that we need to create much more information and data. ISDR and with many partners have created a global risk data platform. I think it's a really great step forward. We need to start using that risk data and combining it with some of the actuarial skills that we have. We do stress testing and risk testing and financial quantification on banks and reserves all of the time. I mean, there's huge capacity out there. We just need to point it in the right direction to help with this problem, which has many similarities. We can deal with uncertainty. We've got hugely sophisticated techniques. It's very frustrating now that we don't leverage some of those. And I think as part of that, we need to see some sort of risk pricing revolution. I mean, on the mitigation agenda, as Sam just mentioned in his introduction, that we're often able to make significant progress because everyone can operate around this commodity of carbon. And it's extremely helpful, even though it's not the whole story. If we can understand the risk pricing structures and operate around that as the key commercial metric and quantified driver for us all, I can see the private sector bringing a huge amount of the solution. So I'm really supportive of that particular revolution, and I know there are initiatives driven often by the insurance industry underway trying to get us to listen to that more firmly. In 2016, I think there's one final thing we could do. I think we could think about the roles of cities as agglomerators of risk reduction. So I think we need to think about how all of the population growth that we'll see over the next 30 years will be accommodated in cities. We're going to invest more in infrastructure in the next 40 years than we have invested in the past 4,000 years. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't help agricultural supply chains enormously, but there's a real concentration of opportunity in our cities to build much more resilient places for people, private sector, and society at large. I'll leave it there, but I'm just really interested in a discussion around some of these emerging thoughts. Thank you.
Good, Dan. So you intended to provoke, so I hope people have been provoked on what matters for 2016 and what a gutsy performance in 2016 might look like. So before we come to people's questions, I would like to pass the microphone to Kamal. You're off mute now, so let's see if we can hear you, Kamal.
Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for this opportunity to participate via video link. I will talk a little bit about what's happening on the implementation of Sendai, what are the challenges we see. I'm really struck by the level of enthusiasm we see for Sendai at the subnational level. Without any prompting, 6 states in India have held consultations on how they're going to take the Sendai work forward. Reference to disaster risk reduction, linkage with climate change adaptation, how it will be reflected in India's INDC has also been quite topical in our national policy discourse. Civil society is hugely engaged as well. I quickly wanted to, based on this last few months of interaction at the subnational level, I quickly wanted to outline for you a number of challenges that I foresee in implementing what is there in the Sendai framework. I group these challenges in three categories: 3 strategic challenges, 3 challenges related to methodology, and 3 challenges related to practical issues. On the strategic level, one of the unique features, or one of the sort of value addition that Sendai does over Hyogo is the whole notion of prospective risk management, or giving enough emphasis on stopping the creation of new risks. Well, it is very easy to say, but when you actually see how it is playing out on the ground, it's very difficult to do, because there are interacting geographies of risk. You may be focusing in a particular territory, say in a fragile hill environment, and enforcing building codes with a lot of enthusiasm and vigor. But what about a highway project which is actually going to increase the flow of people, assets, economic activity in that fragile environment? So you have one process which is actually aimed at reducing the creation of new risk, another one trying to increase the exposure, and we don't have methods to actually measure that, understand that, and address that. The second point, Debbie mentioned that there is increased emphasis on local level. That's a big issue here as well. We indeed recognize the importance of investing at the local level. But then in a situation where at the local level, the planning systems in general are very adequate, how do you bring in disaster risk reduction planning at that level? So the overall planning framework itself at the local level is rather weak. Or can we use disaster risk reduction as a lever to institute good planning practices at the local level? Also, in parts where there has been effort at doing local level disaster risk reduction plans, are we going to retrofit those plans in light of Sendai? I think that's a big question. Or should we rather focus on implementation? The third strategic point is that the Sendai work and a lot of what is enshrined in it, it doesn't have an aspirational tone. It doesn't speak to the mainstream development narrative of our countries. You know, the mainstream narrative is 100 smart cities, housing for all by 2022. So how do we sort of, rather than just introducing disaster risk reduction as, an additional filter of clearance, like environment clearances, how do we sort of give it a positive spin and make the narrative more aspirational? So those are some higher level strategic issues. On the specifics of measuring, methodology, etc., the first point I would like to make is that translating the global targets into local targets is going to be very difficult. It's creating a lot of confusion at the local level. People want to do it. There is lack of clarity as to, if the global targets are qualitative, substantially reduced, should we stick with that, or should we come up with our own very specific, quantified targets? There are also issues around other targets, like number of affected people. So who's affected? Economic losses. There is huge issue with regards to baseline. For measuring against some of these targets. So I think there's a lot of work before us to sort this out and make sense of it from a local perspective. The second point is that hazard risk and vulnerability assessment in our part of the world has become highly fashionable in the last 5 to 7 years. I think 17 states in India, which is more than half the country, have done some sort of hazard risk and vulnerability assessments. But these are not yet speaking to policymakers who are actually responsible for fiscal governance in the country. So Finance Commission is ready to give us money for relief, but they think that we don't yet have a clear, quantified case for investment in risk reduction yet. So how do we take the hazard risk vulnerability assessment to a next level so that it really speaks the language of people responsible for fiscal governance in the country? A related point on risk assessment is that Sendai now brings in other hazards into the fold as well. Biohazards, chemical hazards. While we have very good systems for risk assessments for disasters emanating from natural hazards, we haven't yet got a handle on how we are going to deal with these other risks, which are highly distributed, very difficult to quantify. So it would be good to see examples of how it has been done before and how we can sort of expand the scope of these risk assessments. Then finally, some practical issues. There is, the obvious but huge issue of capacity at all levels. The capacity development can't be just for disaster risk reduction or for resilience. It has to be across the board. To make a city safer from earthquakes, you need to have capacity, across the board, from people who do bar bending to masons, to people who do concrete work, to engineers, to people who manage the building permit system. And that whole thing is really overwhelming in terms of the scope of work that really needs to happen. And the current models of capacity development we have are clearly not enough. Even in cases where we have done some sort of training as part of capacity development, a lot of supply has been provided, but not sort of enough demand has been created. So there is this whole issue of capacity, which could be a matter of a workshop in itself. Then there is the issue of prioritization. How do we sort of look at Sendai and come up with very specific priority actions which can begin to deliver results very quickly? Let me give you an example from the area of implementing building codes. You could spend 10 years setting up a system for having good building codes, having them in bylaws, having the capacity in the municipality, having the capacity in on construction sites, inspection systems, to actually have a working system. So while you're doing that, you could also just come up with, take some really, the previous speaker used the word gutsy, take some gutsy policy decisions that, look, this is an area which is highly prone to earthquakes. We will, from tomorrow onwards, we will completely outlaw unreinforced masonry buildings. Simple, just one thing which is very practical, but which we know is going to reduce risk. And it doesn't necessarily require an elaborate system, which is not to say that an elaborate system of risk governing is not required. But, how do we prioritize and take some actions which deliver results? And my final point is that a knowledge system which is integrated, a scientific and technical community which is integrated, which works in a multidisciplinary way, which is focused not on just narrow service delivery on as asked basis, but sets up a national system of knowledge creation, of building the science of disaster risk reduction. To illustrate that with an example, if you wanted to test a particular building technology for earthquakes or for winds, you could easily go to a scientific, to a technical establishment that would test a model for you and tell you, how the building behaves and what you need to do to sort of come up with a more resilient design. But that's very narrow, very specific service delivery, which can only reach a small number of people. How do we set up sort of a system which actually leads to a multiplier effect in terms of access to that kind of knowledge? So this is all I have for you this afternoon in my initial remarks. Happy to engage in the conversation and discussion as we go along.
Thank you, Kamal. That's great. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to you with questions. So the floor is open. We've got about 20 minutes for some Q&A. I've got one question from India, but I'd like to see if there's any in the room before I go back to India. Yes, maybe you could use the microphone first of all, say who you are and where you come from, and